Hey, Dr. Kelly Watson here, and I am going to talk today about what happens if you're asked to guest lecture. So just some tips from the trenches um, if you get the opportunity to be a guest lecturer somewhere. So the first one is get to know your audience. It's really important that you tailor your content to the background and level of the students that you're going to be in front of. It sounds obvious, but there is definitely a difference between undergrads and particularly freshmen versus seniors versus MBAs. Or somebody who's in an executive ed or a DBA type program. So really important to understand the level. And if you're not familiar with students that age, then talk to the instructor and see if you can get as much information about the students and their expectations of a guest lecturer. Maybe the host instructor knows that this particular class is super quiet and tends to, not really put up their hand. That's something to note before you go into the room so that you're not thinking it's you. Um, and maybe it's because, the host instructor is not able to connect at the right level with them. So, you may want to think about diving into, what are some of the challenges that the host instructors have in the classroom so that you can kind of tailor it accordingly. It's also great to ask for a copy of the syllabus because, understanding the overall course and where your guest lecture is going to show up in the context of things and getting a sense for what concepts have been taught before, because maybe you're coming in to talk about something that they have already covered, in which case you're going to want to provide a lot more practical real world examples and a lot less sort of foundational. But maybe it's a topic that they either haven't had yet, because sometimes, as a professor, sometimes I have to put people into dates just because of where they sit in the calendar, and we may not have covered the information yet. And so if that's the case, then it's great for you to be able to give more foundational stuff. And be open to asking the host instructor to provide their version of what that foundational stuff is, so that you don't, it's not that you can't contradict them or provide an alternative model. That's totally fine. But sometimes it can be frustrating for the host instructor if they've been telling students all semester, one thing or one way to complete a SWOT analysis, for example, and then their guest speaker comes in and says, well, here's how the SWOT's done, and it's completely wrong. So it's important to just check in with the instructor on where this fits and what kind of material is required to kind of get to what you're about to present, and if you need to help bridge that gap for them, and what that would look like. Also, they may have had 3 or 4 guest speakers already this semester, so you also don't want to duplicate something that somebody else has covered. So it's really important to understand where you fit in the entire course. It seems like this is obvious, but clarifying the logistics, like what's the time limit on this? How long do you want me to speak? How's the class set up? If they're set up in a circle, that could be very different than set up in a traditional sort of auditorium style. You may want to, understand what you're working with, especially if you're going to have them do anything that requires moving around. You just want to understand the setup and what the classroom limitations are. You also want to understand what classroom possibilities there are. Do they have a projector? Do they have sound? Are you able to play a video? Are you able to, utilize materials? Like maybe you need sticky notes for an activity, or dry erase boards, or notepads on easels. All of that is available, but you probably have to talk about someone. You may want to ask about, do they want the materials in advance? Maybe they can provide it to the students so the students can take notes in the PowerPoint, if that's something that you want them to be able to do. And then, be open to feedback. If you've got an idea and you've provided these slides and the instructor says, hey, I'd really like you to change this, be open to that. I mean, you're there to enhance their classroom. You're also there, of course, to get experience and to be able to share this great knowledge that you have that you're bringing to the classroom. But, you want to make sure it's aligned and that it's working for the instructor. And the reason for that is because the host instructor is going to invite you back if you are an integral part of their class and that you really bring something special to the class. So ask them. I will say that a lot of times when I have guest speakers in my class that are from industry, the students love to just have free form Q&A for a lot longer than you would expect in a normal speaking situation. And topics can start out to be about strategic management or whatever I'm teaching, but it can very often lead into, well, how'd you get started in your career? You said that you've traveled internationally. Where have you traveled to? How did you get an overseas assignment? Stuff that maybe doesn't have anything to do with your topic, but is super helpful and relevant to the kiddos. And you want that, right? Like I would think that most host instructors would be delighted to have you veer off course if that is something that's, valuable to the students. So, but just make sure that you've, partnered with the host instructor and that they're aware of what you're teaching and you're aware of where you fit in all of that. Next piece of advice I would have is that you should really focus on the practical application as much as possible. So it's one thing for you to come in and teach a concept or a theory, especially, if you're a DBA, you have studied a lot of these theories and maybe know it really, really well. But that can be pretty dry for students. And what they really want to hear from you is, how does this apply in the real world? So as much as possible, giving, the context and giving the real case studies from your research or your industry experience, that is of tremendous value to students. So, keep your theory to frameworks or kind of introductory information, and then immediately kind of jump into the practical application of it, because that's going to be much better received. All right, jargon. Let's talk jargon, because one of the things I've noticed about when I'll bring in a guest speaker is that they're from a particular industry and they're used to talking to people who are only in their industry. And so they have this language or this jargon, and it's really hard for students to understand that because they haven't really worked in any industry, or very few generally. And so then this person comes and starts dropping acronyms and using words they've never heard. And it makes them feel stupid and insecure when really it's just a lack of experience. And it also just slows their comprehension, because if they're constantly having to put up their hand and ask you what those three letters mean, they may stop doing it, first of all, in which case they've disengaged. But also it can be really jarring and disruptive. So very much plain language, the kind of stuff that if you were telling your mom about what you do for a living, that you would use, and keep it clear, keep it simple, keep it relevant to business too, especially with younger students. Sometimes people come and start giving career advice and start giving, life advice, and it can be inappropriate and not what the host instructor is interested in having you do. So be careful. Oh, and also, most of these host instructors are going to be PhDs, right? They're going to be academics, tenure line people. Too much of you trying to prove that you are good enough to be in the classroom, and let me prove my academic chops by, pulling on a whole bunch of theories. It'll tend to make you look insecure with the host instructor, and you don't have to be. You've got the real world experience that they don't have. So instead of trying to be what you're not, really focus on what you are, which is phenomenal and highly experienced. All right, if you haven't heard me talk about interactivity before, I'm a big proponent of ditching the long lecture and instead doing some kind of activity. So talk about, your career, talk about how you got started, talk about whatever your concept is. Definitely share your experience, and then dive them into an activity. Get them to do something, so you could have role playing, you could have what would you do scenarios, and then you can, in a way that a regular instructor can't, you can actually show what actually happened. So give them some kind of problem that you had at work, and then give them a chance to scurry around and try and solve it. And then, come in with, well, here's what actually happened. That is so great, because very few of the case studies that students work on in class have an actual, industry expert who says what really happened at the end. So super, super fun. I always recommend trying to learn as many names as you can in a short period of time. It's really hard, obviously. My goal as an instructor is by the third class, I know all 90 of my students in a semester. I know their names, know, kind of their major, what they want to do. It's hard, and, it takes a lot of memory tricks, But if there are some students who stand out in the number of times they've raised their hand or they're participating, try to engage, try to get their name, and then try to use their name, because it makes people feel like $1,000,000, and it tends to get you more engagement because people are like, wow, that person remembered my name. I'm going to try again. I'm going to, give more, which makes just all classes a lot more fun when you have engagement, when people are responding. And then, here's something that's a little tricky, but be mindful of microaggressions, because the students these days are very in tune with um, with making sure that the right language is used, or that microaggressions are avoided. And I often find that when I get a guest lecturer who's been in the workplace for a very long time, maybe um, they're less attuned to some of the things that could be microaggressions. So don't assume anybody's gender, for example. Um, don't assume that someone of a different race is from a different place. Don't ask where people are from. Um, Even if they have an accent, it's better to just let them tell you that they're from somewhere interesting. Try not to make categorizations about about gendered roles in the workplace, or, what people from different countries are like, these types of things. I find it best to sort of stay away from anything that could trip you into a microaggression in any way. Um, and then, tell stories that are from your journey. Anything about your own personal background can be super exciting for students, because, they're looking to be leaders in business in the future, or, um, at any rate to engage in businesses. And so they want to know what that's like, and they want to know from someone who's successful like you, what was it like when you got started? And, especially vulnerabilities like mistakes you've made and things like that. That type of stuff, being able to see that it's going to be okay, even if you make mistakes, is really powerful for the students. So, but yeah, and you can talk about client projects you've done, you can talk about research findings, and just, use storytelling to make the lessons come to life. And again, obviously, if you have a time constraint, you'll want to, structure what you're going to talk about, and build in time for storytelling, so that you don't end up, exceeding your welcome by going over time. Another thing I'd like to recommend is to provide leave behinds. Leave them with a one pager or a framework or a checklist or something, so that they got something out of the lecture that they feel like is a little more permanent. You could say, hey, I've been talking about some stuff. There's this great book that I, read, and provide the name of the book, or a tool that I've used. I like to use the business plan canvas, so here's a leave behind of it, and, here's how I use it, or something like that. Um, and then once you have, last thing is, you may want to take a picture with the students. It's a great way to make them feel like, wow, we had this special guest with us, this, a little bit of a celebrity. So, get the class to take a picture with you, and then afterwards, put that up on your LinkedIn. And what's great about that, and share it with the instructor, because the students will also then tag themselves and share it on their LinkedIn. So it kind of gets you a little bit of publicity and builds your teaching profile a little bit. Obviously, add it to your academic CV as well, that you guest lectured here. And then if you can, and you think things went really well and the students seem engaged, ask the host instructor for a testimonial, so that you can post that alongside um, when you add it to your academic CV. Also, after, the next day or whatever, reach back out to the host instructor and ask them for feedback and get specifics, not just, oh, that was great, but what went well, and then what would they change next time? And what's great about that is it shows that you're willing to build your teaching chops, that you're willing to learn, and that you're willing to modify if things didn't go perfectly. And it's just more likely that you'll get another opportunity with the host instructor in the future. And you definitely want to keep the doors open at all times, because it's just great to keep, to be called back. It also is efficient because you can sort of prepare for the same class year after year, and it sort of becomes an easy win. So yeah, so I hope you get the opportunity to guest lecture. And if you do, just be yourself, bring your passion for the subject, and share what you have done in your wonderful storied life about in business. And the students are just going to get so much out of it. So I hope this was helpful, and good luck.